We're live. My guest today is Rushi Manche. He is co-founder of Movement Labs. Movement is a modular framework to build and deploy move-based blockchains, applications, and infrastructure in any distributed environment. Today, we're going to discuss, well, what is Move? What is this language? And why are people so excited about it? We'll talk about Movement Labs' modular Move VM. We'll also discuss why they're building their product as an Avalanche subnet. We'll also talk about the long-term vision and collaboration and integrations with Cosmos, and also their M1 network that will effectively be the launch product for Movement. I'm also dying to find out why he thinks Solidity will never be globally adopted at a mass scale. Before we get started, make sure to hit the like button, hit the notification bell, and subscribe to get notified when I go live every week. And remember that none of what we discuss here on the Interop is investment advice. And if you enjoyed this content, please consider staking with us. We're live on Evmos, Quicksilver, Osmosis, Juno, and now on Nolus. Just look for Interop in the active set. And Nebula Summit is like 17 days away, and that's both exciting and scary. I hope you are coming to Nebula Summit. It's happening on the 24th and the 25th of July in Paris. It's 2 days of technical talks about IBC, Cosmos, the Interchain, and so much more. Ethan Buckman, Zaki Manian, and Jack Zamplin were just announced as speakers. So with all of the other speakers we have as well, it's going to be amazing. We also have Nebula Hack Day on July 23rd. That is a full day of technical talks by the likes of DYDX, Neutron, Osmos, Juno, OKP4, and other teams that will be giving tech workshops there. That's totally free for anyone to attend. Go to nebula.builders for more. My guest, Rushi, is coming up next, right here on the Interop. Hey, Rushi, thanks for joining.
Hey, what's up, Deb? How's it going?
Great. Yeah, really excited to talk about Move today and Movement and the Move VM and all of that exciting stuff. But first, yeah, how did you become part of this project and how did you get so interested in Move?
Yeah, so I've kind of been a nerd and engineer for most of my career in life. Started off doing like systems and database security at a health insurance company. Kind of stumbled across DeFi and crypto in general when I was at Ethereum DeFi scene, started doing smart contract engineering, was from DEX stuff, indexing protocols, in the Ethereum DeFi space. Really got interested in Cosmos ecosystem, like played around in Cosmosm and some namespace stuff. But ultimately really like saw the benefit of this new language that's coming out called Move. At the time, a little bit of context of the language. It was designed by the Facebook DM or Libra project. A few years back, there was actually a book called The Move Book written by the DM folks. And since then, the Facebook had to kind of disband the project because of some regulation issues. There's kind of the foreshadowing for what we're seeing now in the United States. But long story short, Facebook couldn't hold on to the project anymore. So the team kind of split up into two. You have Aptos and Aptos Labs, and Sui from Misting Labs as the two main sects that split up into it. Raised a lot of money, probably the most well-funded ecosystem in space right now, outside of obviously Ethereum. And yeah, I think when I kind of stumbled across the white paper first and read the Move book, I was like, wow, this is very interesting. Because it was the first stab at a mainstream, like obviously Meta and Facebook, really penetrating into smart contract development. I don't think anyone has remotely come to that. Like Google Cloud has done some stuff, AWS has supported infrastructure, but in terms of actually creating financial infrastructure and railroads, it's never been done before. So that sort of first got my interest. And then we looked deeper into language semantics. It was very interesting. And we're going to chat on why Move later. But it kind of solved all the issues that I was facing as a Solidity developer, and personally just fell in love with it. And then got the Aptos ecosystem, was an engineer for some DeFi protocols. My co-founder built the first yield aggregator in the space. So we're kind of like one of the first builders in the ecosystem. But we didn't really like how it was handled in terms of Aptos and Sui. In terms of being very developer friendly, and also focusing on ecosystems where the users are already there, where there already is DeFi volume, where there already is wallet technologies, where there's already railroads and infrastructures. And we wanted to bring the fruits of this new language to ecosystems where there was set communities. And I guess we can delve deeper into that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting to go back at that time when Facebook was announcing Libra, and just it wasn't even regulatory pushback; it was just political pushback. It was just
Yeah,
like this flood of like FUD around the biggest social media network, social network in the world, building their own currency. And
yeah,
I think a lot of people, that project was then rebranded to DM, and then it was dismantled. But I think people don't realize the impact that this project had on policymakers. Like when we were working with folks in the European Commission a couple of years ago to craft the MiCA regulation, this was in 2020. The amount of folks that were just like holding on to this Libra idea and essentially saw everything bad in crypto, sort of like extrapolated that into what they had seen in Libra, was insane. And so everybody was kind of focused on this thing, even though it didn't exist anymore. And they sort of saw all of crypto and DeFi as mirroring, the risks of Libra and Facebook, entering sort of the currency market. And so it was really it had lasting effects, even though the project doesn't exist anymore. It really had
yep,
lasting effects, I think, on like opinions, in policy and in enterprise.
yep. I think that's what we saw from a developer point of view, because I think Solidity was a great first precursor, but it was like, okay, who's actually writing Solidity? What enterprises using Solidity in the guardrails? So when Move first came out, all like the engineers were like, oh my God, this is like finally something that's like defined by one of the biggest companies in the world. And that's what drew like a lot of developers to it originally.
So how many developers are there in this ecosystem really? Because I read I read some report. I think it was like the Electric Capital report, and
Yeah.
they said that it was the fastest growing developer ecosystem. Like the absolute numbers are fairly small, but relative to other ecosystems, it's growing very fast. And what's your sense of how big the developer ecosystems are?
Yeah, I actually just pulled up the document, but Swedes at I think April as of April 1st, it's 67 since then, and then Aptos is on the same. So combined, they have around the same as BNB, more than BNB chain, and around the Polygon numbers. So if you were to put them to be around like seventh most already off the bat, I think there's two interesting things on the electrical cap report that I took away from that. A is the growth rate. So we compare growth rates to similar ecosystems. The only ecosystem that's gotten close to what Aptos we have been able to pull off is Solana. So when I offer explain to like the Move ecosystem, there's two main things. A, I kind of call it like the precursor to Solana. When you look at Solana's trajectory, it took a few years for it to kick up. People were like, "What's this new programming language? Like, why not Solidity? Like, why am I doing this?" Um, and that's what we're seeing in the early stages. Except now you have $650 million already committed, like to be poured in the ecosystem, which is quite a lot of money. And then B, you have the ability for this large APAC presence. So if you look, I'm currently calling for the APAC region. I was at a Sweet Builder House in Kyoto, but in Korea, Japan, Taiwan, these regions are especially blowing up with new developer activity, especially as US regulations increase, and a lot of macro trends are shifting towards APAC region. This is an opportunity where Move developers and people building Move infrastructure can really capitalize it, right? You're the fastest growing developer environment. It's already at sixth or seventh most off the bat. And now you have the ability to scale in regions where the economy is booming.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, here in Europe, at least, I don't hear a whole lot of people talking about Move and
Yeah.
Aptos and Sui, apart from investors. But yeah, I didn't know that there was this growing ecosystem of developers in Asia and APAC region. Um, so let's maybe kind of decipher the difference between Aptos and Sui. Like, why are there two chains doing building effectively what seems at the outside like the same thing? Are they different? And which one of them is maybe leading, or like what's your sense of what that looks like?
Yeah. So people have mixed opinions on who's the better chain. For it doesn't really
Of
make
course they
sense
do. It's
for
crypto.
Yeah. But ultimately, we're in a bear market, so it doesn't make sense to squabble over who's a better move chain. Like the liquidity and like volume on both these chains are like going to be lower substantially because it's a new chain. Solana took years to see like uproar, and that's what's going to happen with Move. So I think how it kind of broke up was Aptos generally got more of the BD people, and Sui got more of the engineers. That's why Sui took a longer time to kind of further iterate upon this Move language. So to give context, the Move language designed by Facebook was more directly inherited by Aptos, and Sui kind of changed it around. Some notable differences where that Sui has a consensus for like a DAG-like consensus. They also have more emphasis on dynamic NFTs. They have this kind of timestamp method called the clock, which is supposed to speed up throughput. But long story short, Sweet is a more enhanced version of the traditional move. The question is, where is like what's the market trends, right? So far, what I've been seeing is that Aptos is more the DeFi scene, and that's kind of where they're putting their bets on. Where Sweet's betting more on gaming. So they're talking gaming studios, onboarding them, doing a good job with the APAC region particularly. So I think both these chains have a way to win. A, because they have a fundraising mode, and B, they're kind of targeting different markets. But I think the current state of the move language is very secular in that, or like very split up in that you have Aptos move and Sui move, which in itself is a different language. So Aptos move and Sui move are completely different languages.
Hey,
Yeah.
yeah, go on.
Oh yeah, I thought you were chiming in. Yeah, so Aptos move is the direct DM version of the move, and Sui move is what you're upon. You can't deploy a Sui move contract on an Aptos move VM. You can't deploy an Aptos move contract on a Sui VM. It's like completely different languages, right? So that does create fragmentation because when you're a bear market, there's X amount of developers, and now you're saying, okay, there's two different like there's a new language, but more on top of that, there's two different styles to move that language. It creates a fragmentation. So one of the goals here, and we'll get more into that, is kind of unify those efforts, right? We believe in this language, we believe it's the future, but we want to democratize it. So bring it to ecosystems where there's is like developers are already friendly, like using the same wallets, using the same APIs, using like 90% of the same tech stack, but just the Move VM or the Move execution layer on top of it is really what we're trying to strive to do here. And then in terms of providing compatibility to both these systems, right now, if you have Aptos DApp, you can't build on Sui. If you have a Sui DApp, you can't build Aptos. We're working on unifying that.
Okay, I mean that sounds a bit complex, right? Like if you have the basically this, the the same language at the start, and now like none of these contracts are compatible with each other. Okay, and so do they compete on? So I get that like Aptos is more DeFi and Sui is leaning more into gaming. Are they competing on other metrics like transaction volume or any other kind of typical metric that people compare blockchains on?
Yeah, I mean it's crypto and crypto Twitter, like generally, like there was like this huge issue at ETH Denver or something where like I think it was Aptos uninvited Sui from the event, and there was like, oh, there's like a whole debacle, which is just child's play. But anyways, yeah, people still compare like, oh, this is the TPS for this chain, it's TPS for this chain, and then in practicality, you're not actually seeing much volume. So it is ultimately just comes down to crypto Twitter and crypto general comparisons, like, oh, this chain is better than this chain. But in the macro, I would say they are competing, but it's good competition, right? The analogy we say is a rising tide lifts all ships. So if Sui is doing really well, that generally brings more developers. So that brings more developers to Aptos and Sui both, and us, right? That's kind of how we're marketing ourselves too. Is great. There's this new language and there's a lot of fundraising around it. Let's try to bring traditional like EVM users and like these EVM maxis to the Move language, which ultimately helps overall ecosystem. And that's what a lot of different groups with the Solana VM are trying to do as well.
So Aptos is already live, is already mainnet, and Sui is yet to launch, I believe.
They're on mainnet. They're on mainnet.
They're mainnet also. Okay, so
Yeah.
how much like liquidity? How big are these ecosystems? Like, what are we talking about here compared to something like Solana or like another
Well,
popular
I
layer
think
one?
liquidity and traction is something that both ecosystems will tell you they're working on because they launched in probably the worst market we've seen, or like one of the worst markets we've seen, so it doesn't help their case. In terms of numbers, I believe Aptos is something around 40 million TVLs. We just launched a month or two back. It's at 15 million TVL. So obviously, in terms of numbers, it's still lacking. But that doesn't strike me as something that's bad or something that's alarming, because any new blockchain, especially a new ecosystem with new language, it takes a while to kick up. If the bet is more on the macro term, like in the next 5 to 10 years, what is the language that's going to win? And I think most developers will tell you it's not Solidity. It's probably some other language. It might not be Move. But the bet that we're making is Move has the most traction right now out of a non-EVM ecosystem. And in the next 5 years, we're betting on multiple ecosystems, not just Movement, not just Aptos, not just Sui, but every ecosystem adopting Move as some capacity.
Okay. The people in the chat here are talking about something. I have no idea what it is, but they're what's this sharp fades that
It's
people
the
are talking
haircut thing.
about?
I think it's the haircut.
Okay. Okay. Anyway, there's some conversations going on about your haircut. Great. Well, let's talk a little bit about like the Move language specifically. What's so great about the Move language, and how does it compare to? Well, one thing that I think a lot of people are familiar with and will have a good understanding is Solidity, but also I think given the context of this podcast, how does it compare to say something like a Cosm Wasm VM, using with applications written in Rust?
Yeah, so I think the best example to point to this would be the DAO attack. I think everyone kind of remembers how bad that attack was. I think it was like 3.6 million ETH, which at the time was like 50 million US dollars. Basically, what the attack was, a large scale ransomware attack. For folks who aren't familiar with what the definition is, it's basically when you're able to get into a flaw in smart contract code, whether it's an integer overflow or like a byte mishap, and basically give the attackers the ability to carry the same transaction repeatedly. So if I'm sending money from me to you, I can make that same request around like 100 times and keep withdrawing ETH without anyone checking on me, because there wasn't any kind of built-in protection to say, hey, this person's sending money from this person with this address. They're only allowed to send X amount of dollars at X amount of time. There's no built-in protection. It's kind of left up to the users and left up to developers. And it's pretty difficult to kind of set this done. I'd say there's maybe a handful of developers that can effectively safeguard applications, and even then, it's like hackers always find a way to, oh, you missed that. The integer was 257 bytes, not 56 bytes. I just got in a system that's $10 million lost overnight, right? So I think on security side, that's really the reason why Move was designed. It's because if you're ever going to see institutions, major gaming apps, banks using smart contract language, it can't be with Solidity, because if, let's say, for example, you have a lending protocol from one bank in Thailand to Indonesia, if that smart contract gets hacked and you lose $1 billion, now it's not just a random DeFi protocol, it's the whole bank as an entity losing the support of its like followers who really, or like people are putting money in it that really need the money, right? So that's originally why Move is designed, right? It has multiple key features. Essentially, as things called, the thesis is formal verification. So developers can choose who has access to a module, which is a function in Solidity, when they have access and why they have access. So if I'm sending money from me to Seb, I can embed it within a smart contract saying this money is going to go to the vault. The vault will stay there for X amount of time. It can only be accessed by Seb, who has this address for X amount of time. If there's any other criteria that's met, it immediately nulls the contract and doesn't go through with it. What that really allows you to do is overarching theme of security. So you have built-in bytecode interpreters and verifiers that before a smart contract is executed, it checks for resource type and memory safety. So those exploitations that happen in Solidity, Rust, and even other like languages like JavaScript, fundamentally not possible in Move, because it won't execute a smart contract if the bugs are present. And then, yeah, that's a little bit more on the security side. I can get more into that. But the second fold is the performance side. So Move is also designed to be the fastest and highest performance language, in likes with the Solana thesis in fast, 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 right? But Move is saying, okay, we want to be as secure as possible, but also have a throughput necessary for these large gaming apps and socialify. I think that's originally one of the main reasons why Facebook designed this language, because if you get integrated into Instagram or Facebook, now you're not talking about 10 users or 100 users DAU, you're talking about billions. And you need a language and you need a framework that can handle those transactions per second. Otherwise, your system's crashing every day. And gaming apps, especially in the bull market, saw that bandwidth get kind of destroyed. If you talk about like DeFi kingdoms, they broke Harmony, then they broke Avalanche, and now they like launched a subnet to kind of handle scaling issues, right? So that's kind of a TLDR onto like why move.
Yeah, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the security, but something that I forgot to ask, which comes back to the previous topic, was in Aptos and Sui, what's the consensus look like? Because that also plays a huge part in throughput, right? It's like transactions
Yep.
being able to be confirmed. Yeah.
So Aptos has like a traditional BFT consensus. Sui uses a DAG, which is, some people don't really call it blockchain technology, but it's like a different kind of consensus. I think both of them are like very instant finality. Consensus is pretty solid. The only issue that tends to pop up with both ecosystems is the centralization issue. The minimum stake on Aptos is 2 million APT, I believe, which is $10 million plus, which means you kind of shut out most of the community because not everyone has $10 million in their bank account to stake Aptos. Sui, I believe, is 10 million Sui or something like that. So long story short, it's a big staking requirement to be able to participate as a validator in these networks, which tends to lead to centralization in both chains. I'm not here to spread FUD or like kind of talk bad about chains, but that tends to be why we see some performance issues in consensus mechanism. If you have 70% of the network dominated by a centralized entity, chances are your throughput isn't that great because it ultimately ends up being sequential. Even if you mark it as a parallel processing system, if you have one centralized entity that runs around 60-70% of the network, some arbitrary number like that, you still need to wait for that one entity to verify each transaction. Versus something like Avalanche, Cosmos, where the validator requirements, staking requirements much lower. Eventually, you can get a permissionless network when you move out validators. Now you have actually the use case of parallel processing, and we've seen that with Solana, obviously, right, with the decentralization. That hasn't happened in Aptos and Sui yet, and it's something that we're working on fixing.
Yeah, I mean, at some point, even Cosmos and Avalanche, as more applications come on those chains and the token prices, probably go up in lockstep. Like the cost of securing that chain is also going to get higher, and also certainly the entry price to become a validator will also become much higher. But that's just a function of like ecosystems growing. So let's talk about the security aspect of Move a little bit more, because a lot of people talk about, and you mentioned this also, that like Move is a very secure language. It has it has formal verification, like type verification, etc. Can you talk about some of the specific features that make it more secure than most other? I mean, maybe the EVM is not a good example, but let's say compared to CosmWasm, which I think like is much more secure than Solidity, and also much more robust and better development environment, etc.
Yeah, I was at the Cosmos Summit in Prague, and I went up on stage and said, "Move is better than CosmWasm." And after the little like talk, I had like 8 angry CosmWasm developers come up to me, like, why do you think it's better? Why do you think it's better? And I was like, okay, this is why. So essentially, there's a few embedded security features that's not really prevalent in CosmWasm and Rust. It's more analogous to what you're seeing in Cairo and Cairo 1 specifically, which is like Starkware smart contract development. But for example, the Move has a built-in bytecode verifier. It uses this schematic called borrowing checking. So there's only one mutable reference at a given time. So for example, if I'm a hacker in Solidity or even Cosmos and Rust, when there is a smart contract, there's multiple like methods or functions that can manipulate at a time. With Move, it specifically defines in the bytecode verifier that there's only one mutable reference at a given time. So if there's a variable or a specific contract that needs to be invoked, there's only one thing that can swap out developers at a given time. And then once that transaction is executed, it can only be modified by the function invoking it, which is a huge difference from traditional languaging protocols, because you can, if you're a smart contract developer, you can say this dApp has access to this smart contract module, which gives hackers and just general people look at smart contracts, the ability to change the identity essentially, and say assert the identity and get into a smart contract, if that makes sense. More so, Move has this embed saying that it's only one person who can access at a given time, and that's the person who invoked the function calling a smart contract. And then once it's invoked, there's only one mutable reference, and the function can change at a given time. So the worst case scenario, the worst manipulation that you have, is a single mutable reference at a given smart contract. So there's none of that rapid re-entity attacks that you see in Solidity. Cosmwasm does a better job than Solidity, obviously, but I think there's a built-in security features that's not present in Cosmwasm. And I think something that's very important to note is, I'm sure that if you were like a cracked Cosmwasm developer, you could get to the point where it was bulletproof. Obviously, there's greater protocols doing that. But for the average developer, imagine like the 23-year-old, just college grad, and he's just picking up a smart contract language. He has to spend years, or he or she has to spend years perfecting Cosmwasm, Solidity, etc., to really get to the point where they're developing bulletproof smart contract code to deploy. With Move, the learning gap is pretty similar. If you know Rust, it takes you 2 weeks to learn Move, and you have built-in security semantics. So you don't need to worry about re-entity attacks. You don't need to worry about formalification. It's built into the language. So even though some people will be like, oh, this language is better than that, oh, this language can actually do it, the question is, how easy is it for the average developer to attain security? I'm sure, like I touched on, if you're like a very good developer, you can do it. But part of what I guess the entire industry is trying to do is, how do you make this more accessible to the average day user, average day developer? And I think Mover does a great job of doing that.
So if you know Rust, it's fairly easy then to pick up Move. Is that right?
Yeah, if you're a Rust developer, like the analogy I use is Move is to Rust as React is to JavaScript. If you know JavaScript, it takes you 2 weeks to pick up React. If you know Rust, it takes you 2 weeks to pick up Move. It's just a difference in like using this like it's called modules, and it's more object oriented, and there's like security mechanisms that you can pick up. But it's a Rust based. Even the VM is Rust based, so it's pretty standard to pick up.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, well, let's dive into movement a little bit and what you guys are building. But before we do that, I wanted to address your hot take from the beginning of the podcast. You said that Solidity would never be globally adopted at a mass scale. I think like your Prague experience, that would probably get a lot of people also coming up to you after your talk. Why do you think that is? Can you defend that argument?
Yeah, I think everyone I've spoken to agrees. Like even like Ethereum, like main engineers are now was saying like these vulnerabilities are too hard and to pick up on mass scale. Like I touched on, if you're like the top 1% developers, you can probably figure it out and like use external libraries to kind of piece together. But there's two things here. A, how do we make this as easy as possible to average developers? If you ever get to a point where it's Web 2 and the average students learning their college environments, or like people learning to build their own websites, and blockchains are that readily available, you want a framework and language that's A, easy to pick up, and B, has as much built-in security and performance mechanisms to make it as easier for developers. It's a concept of abstraction, right? How can we abstract away the security mechanisms? Sure, in Solidity, sure, in different languages, you can add a bunch of different libraries, put it on pull like pieces together, and get decently secure code. But the average developer is not going to be able to do that. And if we're ever going to hit the point adoption where there's millions and millions of developers, the language that's going to be used the most is the one that's the easiest and most abstracted. That's why JavaScript blew up, right? It wasn't the C++ or it wasn't like the assembly language, right? It was the higher level, well documented, like widely used language that pretty much abstracted away the user experience. Like it's pretty easy to launch web applications with JavaScript. React was more specialized in that it was easy to spin up your own iOS app, spin up your own website. Pretty straightforward. So I think that's the bet with anti-Solidity. It could be some other language besides Move. But in the current state, Solidity is very weak in terms of security, like built-in mechanisms. And then be on the performance side, it's just not able to handle parallel processing. There are a few teams trying to work on like Monad, who's bringing this like parallel processing to EVM. But traditionally, Solidity is not built, and the EVM itself is not built to handle higher throughput needs. So if all goes well and we actually hit the million user mark and plus, you can't have that with 5 TPS. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, that's That's something that it's very difficult to square with people who are like really vested in Ethereum. Is
Yeah.
and I mean, I love Ethereum. I was like always loved that project since I first heard about it. But yeah,
Yeah, I
it's
think
difficult to see how it scales. It is really difficult to see how um, it grows to kind of like mass adoption level without some significant changes to the VM.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that Solidity is not Ethereum, right? Just like Move is not necessarily Aptos Sui. You can believe in Ethereum and not believe in Solidity. Like you can say, like, "Oh,
Absolutely, yeah,
Ethereum is the most decentralized. Ethereum has all the volume. Ethereum has all the TVL." You're right in all metrics. And a lot of groups are now coming out and saying, "How can we take the best parts of Ethereum but remove the worst parts?" So that's where the layer two kind of app chain thesis and what folks at Optimism, Arbitrum are trying to do, as well as the ZK groups. And I think that's our thesis going forward, right? We believe in these existing ecosystems, Cosmos, Ethereum, Avalanche, etc. But how can we leverage how can we leverage these already established ecosystems and fundamentally improve them on a user-friendly level, so it's built in the SDK, and B, on a level that doesn't change your user experience. So you still use the same wallets, use the same APIs, but now you can kind of use Move without even knowing it. That's kind of what we're trying to get at.
yeah, and that's a huge challenge. Like,
Yep.
I think like you said, even Solidity developers agree that Solidity is probably not the language that will take Ethereum, through the next say 10 years. But there's huge technical debt there, and just seeing how long it took to move Ethereum to proof of stake, and now imagine changing the VM so that Solidity is no longer the language. Now, of course, L2s are going to address that by having sort of VMs that that leverage Ethereum as a DA layer, but Ethereum for now at least, I don't know of any plans to change to update the VM. All right, let's dive into movement. So, what is movement, and what is it offering to developers? And I guess the broader question is like, where does it sit with regards to Aptos and Sui?
So to explain what movement is, essentially is a modular. It's part of the modular thesis. So it's a modular move framework to bring the execution environment to different ecosystems. So we're starting with Avalanche, which is our first chain called M1. It's using the great subnet technology and leveraging the Move virtual machine. And the vision is to unify different ecosystems with one centralized SDK. So if I can deploy a Move smart contract, and it can exist on different ecosystems where A can be adopted as a standard for Ethereum, Avalanche, etc. And B, have a unified bridging mechanism. So no matter where I am, if I'm an Avalanche maxi, if I'm Ethereum maxi, I can still believe in Move and use the same DeFi apps and the same wallet infrastructure. So long story short, it's a modular execution layer that brings the Move language to different systems.
So movement is when you say that movement can deploy to different ecosystems. So it's sort of like a more of a development framework than so much or than a VM.
Yep, it's more of a development framework and the execution environment. I think if you have you heard of Fuel Labs, they kind of did like a whole
Yeah,
Fuel VM
of course.
on top of different systems. We're following kind of a similar playbook, except we're trying to unify all the different execution environments. I think something that I came across as a developer is if I'm trying to deploy a smart contract, there's like 100 different chains, 100 different SDKs, 100 different CLIs. It's a very fragmented approach in terms of how can I deploy smart contracts, which A deters users because we're even seeing that within the Move community. You have two different environments, two different blockchains. It fragments the user experience, it fragments the development environment. What if there's a way that you can create a centralized SDK, have developers build on one SDK, create toolings on top of that, and can deploy different chains. It's particularly why the Cosmos SDK was brilliant, right? You have the ability to spit up app chains at will. You can just IBC connect all of them, and it was a revolutionary thing. But our thesis is let's bring a Cosmos SDK-like feel to execution layer environment where we can deploy Move smart contracts and unify all these different systems that are fragmented.
Okay, so when you say that you can deploy these applications, you can use the SDK to deploy to different chains. You're talking about deploying to different Move VMs, or is there is the SDK also compiling sort of move code into, say, Solidity or some other like bytecode that can be deployed on,
Yeah.
say, like an Ethereum chain.
So this is some alpha, but we're working on a compiler that can turn this move code into Solidity code. And that is coming out very shortly once we come out with the raise announcement and the whole like marketing gig. But for the first few iterations, it's going to be the move VM because we're going to ecosystems where it's fairly portable, and it's kind of why we settle on Avalanche as the first stop. It's kind of in the prerogative of the Avalanche tech stack to be cross VM and be interoperable with the subnet architecture. So it made it really easy to deploy the move VM on top of it. And then when we go to different ecosystems, it could be a compiler that directly turns the move code into EVM, or it could be potentially bring the move VM to like rollups and whatnot.
Okay, very cool. Well, you heard it here first. um, yeah, thanks for sharing that. So, this framework, um, it so going back, it allows developers to build move contracts and deploy them to any move environment. Are they writing an Aptos SUI or Aptos move or SUI move?
So right now it's Aptos move, but we'll have compatibility for both styles.
Okay. And is there going to be like some higher level of abstraction where you could just write like in one language and it then deploys to both types of move VMs?
So there wouldn't be any need to do that because at the move VM level itself, Aptos and SweMove are different, but they're more designed like SweMove is designed for the Sui consensus. Aptos Move is designed for Aptos consensus. The move standards and benefits are kind of similar in both. Some argue that SweMove is radically better than Aptos. So as of right now, where we're standing, it's like Aptos and SweMove, like the ability to launch in both. We are talking with some ZK folks, and there could be some ZK move, which kind of has the upper level extraction, but it's more down the roadmap. There doesn't really need to be a need for that so far.
Okay. So you don't need to compile down to like some
Yep.
common thing.
Yep.
Okay. Interesting. So where does M1 sit in all this?
So M1 is the Avalanche chain. Technically, it's speaking in subnet, but we mark it as a layer one on top of Avalanche consensus. It's one of the first of its kinds in that we're able to bring a novel new technology to the Avalanche ecosystem. So that is what we mark it as M1, a module layer one. And then we're able to have different expansions like M2, M3. Kind of the inspiration was the Tony Stark Iron Man Mark One, in which that was his first like suit of armor, and then he's able to upgrade that with more iterations. So that's kind of where we drew inspiration for the Mark One chain.
Okay, so the M1 chain is an Avalanche subnet
Yep.
that allows people to deploy move smart contracts.
Yep.
Yeah, why did you choose to build on Avalanche?
Yeah, that's a question we get a lot. And there's a few reasons. A, the Avalanche is pretty much one of the only places where cross VM or multiple VMs is possible. Avalanche in the past with the Rust VM, obviously they're EVM compatible, but they essentially have this suite of gRPC APIs that are exposed to an EVM called Avalanche Go. So essentially what you're able to do is plug and play different VMs into the consensus mechanism. So for example, if you have a Solana VM or Rust VM, you can put it on, you can spin up as a binary subprocess on top of the gRPC APIs on Avalanche Go, and then now you can send Solana VM transactions to Avalanche consensus. So A, technically it was the best and probably only place that we could build on top of as of right now for the first chain. And then B, in terms of liquidity, that is a huge struggle that Aptos and Sui are facing. Obviously, 40 million and 15 million TVL aren't that flattering. Solana saw in the first 2 to 3 years it kicked up, and then FTX erected, unfortunately, but hopefully they're kicking back. But what the benefits of Avalanche is the technology called Avalanche Warm String. So essentially, any DeFi protocol, let's say your yield aggregator on Aptos, you didn't have much yield to aggregate. It was pretty much next to nothing. Order books had no orders to really book. Those same DeFi protocols can launch the M1 chain and natively tap into liquidity and user base that exists in the primary chain. So a yield aggregator can, in theory, use primary chain assets. Order books can, in theory, use primary chain assets. It's something that it's more analogous to what IBCs did for Cosmos, and it's something that is on an ecosystem where it's EVM mostly.
Okay, so you said something interesting here that I wasn't aware of, or that I'd like to unpack a little bit. Is you said that the Avalanche consensus works with any VM because of these gRPCs that allow the VM to talk directly to Avalanche consensus. How different is that from ABCI on Cosmos tenement chains?
So it's pretty similar in terms of conceptually. I think that Avalanche Go is more better documented, and it's also there's better use cases of ABC, better use cases of Avalanche Go. You have us, you have Rust VM, you have the EVM, obviously. I believe ABCI is used for obviously EVM, and then folks are working on a Solana VM, but there hasn't been any kind of deployed concept. And I think it's pretty similar in terms of general aspects, but Avalanche Go is more directly saying, hey, you can plug in your VMs into our consensus, and it's really public and open sourced and documented very well on the Avalanche website.
Okay, interesting. Cool. And so you're launching this as a subnet. And the idea is that M1 serves also as a way to move liquidity in and out of Aptos and Sui by virtue of being Avalanche. I mean, Avalanche is like one of the largest ecosystems. There's tons of liquidity there. What are you doing here to like bootstrap that process? And is M1 like, does M1 act as a sort of hub between Avalanche, Aptos, and Sui, and then later on like other ecosystems? Is that like the vision here?
Yep, the vision is to have M1 as the hub for these ecosystems. We believe that if we can have a first stepping stone as an alternative to the main two move chains, that's already off the bat a lot better for the experience they're seeing in Aptos and Sui. A, for tokenomics reason, which I can get into later, and then B, just from a pure tech stack. We notched 146,000 TPS a few days back, and the ability to have multiple chains within subnets, communicate with subnet to primary chain. Essentially, we're able to bring what like the Cosmos-like feel to the Move language, and then we can bring that same tech stack to other systems. It's kind of what like Polymer is doing with IBC, right? This IBC started off within Cosmos, and then they bring the IBC now to other systems, which is very attractive.
Okay, very, very, very neat. And so, when people are using the movement framework, they can use that framework to deploy to M1, and then obviously like all of the other move VMs or chains.
Yep.
Will Aptos and Sui DeFi protocols and applications deploy on M1?
Yep. So the benefit is that we're fully compatible with any Aptos Sui code. So let's say you have some DEX on Aptos, it takes you 10 to 15 minutes to launch on top of us. And it's obviously no brainer. Like, why would you not like launch on other ecosystems where there probably is more liquidity and volume when you can just do it in 15 minutes? And then I think that's how the user experience, and we're working on and have onboarded some of the bigger protocols in the space.
And I read about this ZK move. Is that a thing, or is that something you guys are building?
So it was a concept first. There was like a few developers that spun out of the Libra project that were interested in creating a zero knowledge runtime for the Move language. So we're still in talks with the team and seeing how we can integrate our tech stack. But the thesis is if we can bring the same like privacy and ability to use ZK proofs to not only have like authentication within the system. I know, for example, Sui has ZK logging. So now when you're logging with wallets on the Sui system, you can use your email and password. So that's something that we're aiming to do as well. Like really bring the technologies and fruits of the ZK technology and ZK proofs to the Move language. So now you're combining the fastest and more secure language with the privacy of the ZK technology.
Okay. How many Move VMs are there in total?
In terms of like live right now?
Yeah, or that are like people are working on.
I would say it's Aptos and Sui have 2 Move VMs, and those are the only 2 live ones on mainnet. And then we're probably one of the first groups, or if not the first group, doing on different systems. And there's one other group, I believe, that's trying to do like a layer 3 move solution. But that's all I know to an extent.
Okay. So you mentioned tokenomics briefly. Can you talk a little bit about the M1 tokenomics?
Yeah, so I think the biggest pain point in both Aptos and Sui with tokenomics, when Aptos first launched, it's probably one of the most hyped projects. I remember like everyone and their mom was talking about this new Aptos chain launching. And then the rollout kind of came, FTX crashed, and then people were looking at tokenomics and like, hey, first of all, Aptos didn't publish it until very late, and then when they looked at it, it was like some ridiculous number, where it was like 60+% was in some way in team investors' hands, even though it's not officially documented on that. When you look at like the breakdown, it kind of boils down to that, and Sweet kind of falls in the same ballparks. So what we're trying to do is very, very community first tokenomics. 60% supply going to community. We really want to incentivize developers, so a huge percent of the supply is going to developer grants, going to ecosystem initiatives, and really trying to minimize how much investor allocation we're taking, and really trying to take the bare minimum to bootstrap ecosystem fund, and make sure that we're able to put the tokens in the hands of the team. If you look what Avalanche did, I believe the tokenomics were like 50% validator rewards, and then like very ecosystem driven focus, and that's why Avalanche is Avalanche. And we're trying to aim to do similar things. If you can incentivize a community first through tokenomics, it will be much more rewarding for the ecosystem in general, and B, you'll be getting developers because now these token grants are worth a lot of money. And then developers now have A, they can run their own validators, so you have more decentralization, and then B, you have supply for them to build on top of.
Yeah, and so to be a validator for M1, you essentially have to be an Avalanche validator, right?
Yep. So you stake AVAX and you stake MVMT as well.
Right. Okay. So the requirement is like the same as having I think you need 200 AVAX to be an AVAX validator.
It's like 2,000 AVAX, and there's
2,000. Yeah.
Yep. Which is, I think at this point it's like $20,000 to $30,000.
Yeah.
Which is a lot less than $10 million.
Yeah. Yeah. Of course. Cool. Yeah. Let's talk about Cosmos a little bit. So I mean, I know you're also like deep into the Cosmos ecosystem. What's the longer term play here with regards to movement and Cosmos?
Yeah, I think just taking a step back, I feel like Cosmos and Avalanche have a very interesting synergy. Like Sunny speaking at the Avalanche Summit, there's a lot of Avalanche folks at Cosmos events. I think it's not an if, it's a when. That Avalanche and Cosmos eventually kind of converge into like-minded theses. Sunny's talking about that with mesh security and how can you like share security with different ecosystems. So that was very exciting to hear about. But overarching, taking a step back, is how can we take these two ecosystems like Avalanche and Cosmos, kind of have different use cases sometimes, and really kind of band together. So we're working with different groups there, or like Polymer, etc. They're taking IBC outside of Cosmos, looking to bring in Avalanche, etc. So that's kind of a potential partnership at that front. I know they're trying to integrate with Eclipse Solana VM, and then we're in talks to do with the Move VM next at that point. But the overarching thesis is how can we bring the Move language to Cosmos? And there's a few different ways you can do that. You can have a Move module, kind of what like Evmo said with the EVM module. You can have a Move zone, so this is fundamental layer 1. And then you can kind of do like the roll-up module thesis, which is kind of what we're going with. If you have the Move execution environment, you can have it published to Celestia. You don't need a consensus mechanism, and you can have IBC enable that. So I think that is the one direction we're going to. Because having 5 different blockchains isn't great for a company to do at early stage, and then B, going more to the modular thesis allows you to tap into different ecosystems while leveraging the underlying tech stack. So if you have a Movium that's modular, you can build on top of Avalanche. You can build on top of Celestia's roll kit, and then obviously enable that to Dimension or something. And then you can even bring the OP stack and bring the Movium or Optimism stack. So that allows us to be flexible. It allows SDK to be flexible. And that's kind of where we're heading at with Cosmos Play.
Okay. And what would it take to then have the movement framework, or specifically like Move VMs, be compatible with IBC? Is that something you guys are working on, or that we should expect from you guys?
Yeah, it should be IBC enabled within the 6 months time frame. Because there's a group called Landslide that's working on making Avalanche itself IBC enabled. So if their testnet goes live well and our testnet goes, it should be out of the box compatible. But even if that doesn't work out, our Celestia rollup should be IBC compatible. If that doesn't work out, you have Polymer able to ZK IBC enable everything. So again, it's not an if, it's a when.
Okay, so you mentioned Landslide. That's interesting. So with Landslide here, the idea would be that to move tokens in and out of Move from Cosmos, you would go through Landslide first through IBC, and then using Avalanche warp messaging, go from Landslide to movement. So it's sort of like there's still a hop between.
Well, right? I think you can use a DEX, for example. If you have a DEX on M1, you can use Avalanche warp messaging to communicate the transaction between our chain and Landslide. And then Landslide can communicate that transaction to Insert Cosmos protocol with IBC. So you're essentially leveraging the two bridging protocols that are native. You don't need layer 0, you don't need XLR, you don't need insert bridge.
Okay, got it. Yeah, I mean, obviously, like the ideal solution is for like everything to be IBC compatible and sort of have native IBC compatibility. I guess like taking a step back a little bit, what's your like? I tweeted this earlier today. It's like, I think that thinking about ecosystems in crypto, it's like, oh, there's the Move ecosystem, or there's like the Ethereum or VM ecosystem, and there's Cosmos and Solana, whatever. I feel like these distinctions are going to become less and less relevant over time. And the way I'm thinking about this is like looking back at computing. If you look back like 20 years ago, there was a really broad chasm between, Linux and Windows and Macintosh at the time, and very little compatibility between those computing environments. But as time grew by, as time went on, and the stack, say like the application stack, became more modular and also more abstracted. Now the differences between those operating systems, or at least like from a user perspective, is very limited. People, you walk into any office, people are using Macs, people are using PCs, they're using Linux and interoperating through this other layer, right, which is the internet.
Yep.
Where do you see? Do you think this is a fit analogy for crypto? And what do you think needs to happen for better interoperability to essentially allow this this vision for all of this state to essentially become interoperable?
Yeah, I think this is a discussion I was having with a few folks. I think the Cosmos direction A is going to trend to a direction where the SDK becomes less important and IBC becomes the most important innovation from Cosmos. I think most people will agree that IBC is the standard and the thing that's going to survive. I think if we can have a level of interoperability across the ecosystem, where users don't know what bridge they're using or users don't know what infra they're using, that's when you kind of get to a level where you can finally have interoperability to the max extreme. Right now, there's like 8 different bridges, and if you want to use a different bridge, you have to like wrap the asset, you have to unwrap the asset, and there's like it's a whole hurdle. I think if there's a world where it could be IBC, it could be warp messaging, it could be whatever bridging protocol that works, and no matter what chain you're on, what ecosystem you're on, the bridging solution isn't known to the user. When you're on a wallet, you want to swap between chains. It just gives you the best rate, and you swap between the whatever bridging mechanism is used. That doesn't really matter. So I think once you get to the level of bridging abstraction, that's when you have something really powerful. Something that we're working on as well is when you have different ecosystems and trying to bring in a unified execution layer, the question is, what bridge are you using? And our answer is, it doesn't matter. It matters what's the lowest fees, what's the lowest latency, what's most secure, and then we provide the best solution to the user, and the user doesn't care what bridge they're using. And I think most 99% of users truly don't care what bridge they're using. It is want their assets transferred.
Yeah, but like, so if we come back to this computing example, like the interoperability in computing doesn't happen at the lower layers. It happens at the higher layer, right? It happens at the application layer almost, right? I mean, there is interoperability, I guess. I mean, like, so we have like we agree on standards like TCP/IP, but if we're talking about the computing layer, we didn't create better standards for like Unix machines to talk to Macs, to talk to Windows. We developed better standards at the application layers for applications to be able to talk to each other. Yeah, how does that overlap with crypto, do you think?
I think that happens at SDK level, right? Like I touched on a minute first open this call is there's so many chains, there's so many different SDKs, so many CLIs. It's a very fragmented approach. I think that's what the next step in this innovation cycle is going to look like. From a wallet perspective, if you're deploying a dApp on SDK, it's one new wallet, whether it's Circle's new wallet they launched, which wallet APIs, or MPC wallets, or different technologies where users don't know that you're using a specific wallet, they're using a specific infra play. They're just able to deploy their smart contracts, use the dApp without wondering what technology use the application infrastructure. So I think there can be a large level of abstraction at the application infrastructure level, which in our case and most new chains cases is the SDK level. SDK is what the developers interacting with. It's how they're developing smart contract. It's how they're communicating with the protocol. And right now it's a very fragmented approach. Where it's different chains, even like Aptos SDK is different from the Sui SDK. So right now, if you're a move builder and you're learning a new language, now there's two different CLIs, there's two different SDKs, two different documentation sets. It's a headache, right? So if we can develop a centralized or one set standard for SDK, kind of like how Java has the Java SDK, right? No one like questions that. Oh, it's just the SDK that everyone uses, and everyone builds on top of it, and now you have great innovation. Java's SDK has also been iterated upon. And now pretty much everyone uses that. If we can get to a point, whether it's us, whether it's Ethereum, whether it's Consensus, whether it's Cosmos, that's one unified like a software development kit. I think that solves pretty much 90% of the hassles developers face.
So where can people learn more about movement and what's on the roadmap for you guys?
Yeah, so we are still technically in stealth, but not really. So we'll be coming out next month. We'll be coming out next month with a raise announcement. Developer docs, testnet is also alpha is done. So it'll be launched shortly, as well as incentivized testnet for some airdrop alpha.
Cool. Well, Rushi, I learned a lot about Move today, which is great because and also movement. So thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, appreciate the time, Seb. Anytime.